January 17, 1943. The oppressive heat of the Philippine jungles clings to every surface, mixing with the musty scent of sweat and earth. Japanese prisoners, mostly women, stumble wearily into the makeshift camp, their bodies broken by the brutal work of forced labor. Their faces, once full of youthful resolve, are now hollow, sunken. For months they have labored without rest, forced to toil in unimaginable conditions under the cruel watch of their captors. Then, in a rare moment of respite, a hushed command spreads through the camp. Rest, recover, no work today. Shock reverberates through the women. The harsh reality of their captivity has never allowed them to stop, never given them a chance to breathe. But now, for the first time in years, they are told to simply rest. The Second World War was a relentless machine, turning everything and everyone it touched into tools of survival or destruction. By 1943, Japan's war effort had spread across much of the Pacific, from the steamy jungles of Southeast Asia to the sprawling islands of the Pacific Ocean. Japanese forces had swept through the Philippines, Burma, and Indonesia, establishing a brutal regime of occupation. The war, far from being a distant clash of armies, had become an all-encompassing enterprise. Every resource was needed, and every available person was put to work. As early as 1942, women in the occupied territories were conscripted into the war effort. They were not soldiers or fighters on the front lines, but their labor was no less crucial. Factories, supply lines, and construction projects required manpower, and women, both local and Japanese, were pressed into service. Many were forced to work in harsh conditions, often enduring long hours in dangerous environments, their bodies pushed to the brink by the unyielding demands of their captors. Simultaneously, the treatment of prisoners of war, particularly those held by Japan, had become notorious. The Japanese military was infamous for its brutalization of prisoners, especially women. The infamous comfort women system is one of the most horrendous chapters of this, where women were taken from occupied territories and forced into sexual slavery for Japanese soldiers. Yet many others were subjected to grueling labor in POW camps, factories, and on the front lines, sometimes with little or no respite, their value seen only in terms of productivity. For these women, the war had become a constant grinding force. Every day was a battle for survival, but as the war dragged on, the toll on the Japanese war machine began to show. Resources were strained, morale waned, and Japan found itself struggling to maintain control of its occupied territories. The situation had reached a tipping point by 1943, when cracks started to form in the facade of invincibility that Japan had projected. By early 1944, Japan's military empire was overextended. The Allied blockade was tightening, cutting off vital resources from the home islands. Food was scarce, medical supplies dwindled, and fuel had become a luxury even for the Imperial Navy. The war that once seemed glorious was now a slow descent into desperation. Every man was needed at the front, and every woman, both civilian and prisoner, became a cog in the machinery of survival. In territories like the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, thousands of women, including Japanese civilians stranded abroad, found themselves interned when Allied forces advanced. Many were wives and nurses, clerks and volunteers who had served alongside the military effort. When Japan's positions began to collapse, these women were rounded up and sent to internment camps by both sides of the conflict. The Allied forces, too, detained Japanese nationals as enemy aliens, though under markedly different conditions from those Japan imposed on its own captives. Inside these camps, life was stripped to its barest essentials. Food rations were minimal. Disease spread quickly through overcrowded quarters. Many women were assigned to heavy labor, building fortifications, clearing jungle terrain, or hauling supplies. They were treated as expendable labor, their exhaustion ignored, their health seen as secondary to the demands of war. Yet amid the cruelty, there were moments of humanity that defied logic, moments that stood out precisely because they were so rare. It was during one of these rare instances, in 1943 and 1944, when Allied forces, particularly the British and Americans, began to take control of the Pacific Islands and inherited responsibility for Japanese prisoners. In several documented cases, including camps in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, Allied officers made the deliberate choice to halt the forced labor of women prisoners. The women, conditioned by years of harsh discipline and punishment, were stunned. Many couldn't comprehend the order to rest. It went against everything the war had taught them about worth and survival. This moment, when captives, once dehumanized and overworked, were suddenly told to stop and recover, would become a small but profound symbol of how war distorts and sometimes restores the meaning of humanity itself. The human angle of this moment lies in the profound confusion and disbelief of the women when they were told to rest. For years, their lives had been governed by a relentless cycle of exhaustion and suffering. They had been subjected to unimaginable hardships, malnutrition, physical punishment, and the mental toll of being reduced to mere tools of war. In this environment, rest had become a foreign concept. Their entire existence had been shaped by labor, sweating in the fields, hauling heavy materials, and working until their bodies gave out. For them, being told to rest was not just a surprise. It was a moment of disorientation. Many had come to believe their value was only tied to their productivity. Without work, who were they? Could they survive without that constant demand? There was a deep emotional weight in the realization that for once, their captors weren't asking for more. In the midst of a war that had consumed everything around them, this small reprieve became a psychological turning point, a fleeting moment when the crushing weight of the war was momentarily lifted. But the consequences of this shift were not purely positive. Many of the women found it difficult to relax, struggling to adjust to a moment where survival no longer depended on labor. Some felt lost in this new reality, unsure how to exist without the ever-present pressure to perform. In this moment of supposed relief, they confronted the deep psychological scars of prolonged captivity and forced labor, grappling with the emotional toll that had shaped their every waking hour. From a tactical standpoint, the decision to stop the forced labor of Japanese women prisoners seemed illogical. The war was far from over and resources were still scarce. Every available laborer, especially in occupied territories, was considered a vital asset in the struggle for survival. The Allied forces, already stretched thin, had to consider the strategic implications of halting forced labor. It was an expensive decision, one that seemed, on the surface, to prioritize human dignity over military pragmatism. Yet, this shift in priorities came as a result of growing concern for the health and welfare of the prisoners. The harsh reality was that by 1944, many of the women who had endured brutal conditions for years were on the brink of collapse. They were no longer productive, and their physical state had deteriorated to a point where they were liabilities rather than assets. Acknowledging this, Allied officers made the decision to halt the work in an effort to preserve what remained of the women's health, even if that meant delaying or reducing the wartime output they could contribute. On a broader scale, this decision reflected the changing nature of warfare. As the war turned against Japan, the focus began to shift from military conquest to the preservation of human life, at least in the case of prisoners. The cost of continuing the exploitation of prisoners, particularly those whose health was irreparably damaged, would have been more detrimental to the Allies' overall strategy in the long run. Thus, in a tactical sense, the decision to allow rest was less about compassion and more about recognizing the practical need to preserve resources, even if those resources were human. The moral angle of this decision is where the complexity of the war's human cost truly becomes apparent. On one hand, halting the forced labor was undeniably a recognition of the prisoners' humanity, a small victory in a war defined by brutal dehumanization. In the chaos and suffering of the Pacific War, where millions were treated as expendable commodities, the simple act of telling these women to rest was a brief acknowledgement that their lives had value beyond mere utility. But there is a troubling moral paradox at play here. The same individuals who decided to stop the labor had, just months before, been complicit in the very system that reduced these women to tools for war. The same men who enforced the grueling work schedules were the ones now offering respite. The ethical dilemma lies in the fact that this decision wasn't born from a sense of empathy, but rather from strategic necessity. These women had been worked to the bone, but their forced labor had been part of a larger, heartless machinery that left no room for human dignity. Moreover, the moral ambiguity of the situation is heightened by the knowledge that, while some women were given the chance to rest, many others continued to suffer, subject to the whims of wartime leadership, their lives dictated by the priorities of a military machine. For the women who were told to rest, the reprieve came late in the war, long after the most significant damage had been done. Their physical and emotional scars would never fully heal, and their experiences would remain a reminder of the inhumane choices made by those in power. Leadership played a decisive role in this shift, from unrelenting exploitation to cautious preservation. The change in how Japanese women prisoners were treated was not spontaneous. It stemmed from decisions made at the command level, often influenced by shifting international norms and internal pressure within Allied ranks. By 1944, leaders in the British and American military hierarchy had begun to understand the political consequences of prisoner treatment. The war was no longer just a battle of armies, it was also a contest of moral authority. For Allied commanders, particularly those overseeing occupied zones and prisoner camps, every decision was scrutinized. Reports of Japanese atrocities against Allied POWs, such as the Bataan Death March or the systematic torture of captives, had sparked outrage across the Western world. In response, there was a growing imperative to demonstrate moral superiority. Offering humane treatment, even to Japanese nationals, was seen not only as a duty, but as a strategic message to the world. That the Allies did not stoop to the barbarity of their enemies. Field officers in charge of camps were instructed to adhere to the Geneva Conventions where applicable, even if Japan itself had not always honored them. In some cases, these leaders went further, choosing to end the forced labor of emaciated women prisoners, not because they were compelled by orders, but because their conscience demanded it. These acts, though rare, showed the capacity for individual leadership to break with systemic cruelty. Even within the rigid framework of wartime necessity, this balance of authority and morality, command, and compassion would shape the events that followed. The moment when the decision to halt forced labor for Japanese women prisoners took effect was not marked by a single dramatic event. Instead, it unfolded quietly, almost imperceptibly amidst the chaos of war. It was the culmination of a slow realization that the cost of continuing the grueling labor outweighed the benefits, and that the women's health had become a strategic concern rather than just a moral one. The women, too, had no idea what to make of the sudden shift. For them, it was as if the rules of survival had changed overnight. They had long since given up hope of anything other than the brutal rhythm of work, and now they were told to rest. For some, this order felt like a brief respite from the constant strain. The sheer shock of it, however, was overwhelming. Years of relentless suffering had conditioned them to believe that their worth was tied to what they could contribute. Being told to rest felt as unnatural as being told to forget the war itself. In the stifling heat of the Philippines or the muggy air of the Dutch East Indies, the prisoners lay in the bare, overcrowded barracks, uncertain of what was expected of them next. While their bodies remained broken, the decision to allow them rest created a psychological turning point. It gave them a brief but significant opportunity to reflect on what they had endured. The women who had worked so tirelessly under duress were given the space, however short-lived, to process their trauma. In some camps, this was the first time they were offered food that had been carefully prepared, not just as sustenance for labor, but as nourishment for healing. In others, medical attention was provided where before it had been denied. This moment, small as it may seem in the grand sweep of history, revealed something critical. The human cost of war cannot be easily measured in terms of productivity. The prisoners had long since been worn down by the machinery of violence and exploitation. But here, in this brief interlude of rest, there was the recognition that perhaps they were not just cogs in a machine. For a fleeting moment, they were allowed to be something more, human. The ripple effects of this decision stretched far beyond the camp walls. As the women rested and recovered, something subtle but significant shifted within them. Many began to realize that their suffering had not been in vain, that their lives were worth more than mere labor or compliance. However brief, the respite was a psychological breakthrough, an acknowledgement that survival did not depend solely on their body's ability to endure exhaustion, but also on the restoration of their sense of self. This change also reverberated through the camp's leadership. Some of the captors, too, were affected by this shift. For months, they had treated the women as expendable labor, as numbers in a ledger rather than as individuals. But as time passed, the realization grew that the women were not just resources, they were human beings. The camp leaders, many of whom had been hardened by years of war, began to question the ethical cost of their own actions. Though it did not erase the brutality that had come before, it marked a subtle, uneasy acknowledgement that mercy, however fleeting, was possible. The broader consequences for the war effort were undeniable. Japan, already struggling under the weight of the war, would not be able to recover the lost potential of its prisoners. Though the women were given a temporary break, the damage had been done. Many would never fully recover from the physical toll of years of forced labor. The sudden shift in treatment, while humane, did little to reverse the broader strategic decline that Japan was facing. The decision to rest them was, in the end, a recognition that the Allied forces were winning, not just through military might, but through a recognition of human dignity, even in the harshest of circumstances. With their captors now questioning the ethics of their treatment, the fate of the women became a footnote in a larger, more profound shift in the tide of war. The immediate aftermath of the decision to allow Japanese women prisoners to rest was a mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty. For the women, the physical respite was vital, but it came too late for many. Years of grueling labor had taken their toll on their bodies. The damage caused by malnutrition, disease, and overwork would not be easily undone. While some began to recover, others remained too weak to truly regain their strength. Many were left with permanent scars, both physical and emotional, from their years of suffering. The camp environment, too, underwent subtle changes. With the cessation of forced labor, there was a brief period of calm. Less work meant fewer tensions and fewer opportunities for punishment or abuse. Prisoners could rest and reflect, some even forming tentative bonds with their captors who now had time to reconsider their approach. The temporary halt in labor allowed both the women and the guards to pause and consider the grim reality of their situation. For the women, it was a chance to breathe, but also a stark reminder of the inhumane treatment they had endured. For the guards, it was a moment of reckoning with the brutality of the system they were part of. Yet this moment of respite did not mark the end of their suffering. Many of the women would be forced to return to the labor camps as soon as their health allowed. The cessation of work was not a permanent liberation. It was a brief, fragile pause in a much larger story of exploitation and war. Despite this, the decision to allow them to rest represented a small but significant shift in the treatment of prisoners. It was a temporary acknowledgement that even in the harshest of times there could be moments of mercy, however fleeting. The long-term consequences of this decision were less visible but no less significant. For the women who survived the brutal years of captivity, the memory of that brief respite lingered in their minds as a symbol of what might have been, of what could have been offered if the war had been fought differently. Yet, in the broader scope of Japan's war effort, the impact was minimal. By 1944, the tide had irrevocably turned against Japan. The Allied forces were pushing back on all fronts, and Japan was already struggling to sustain its military and industrial capacity. The decision to allow prisoners a temporary reprieve from labor came at a time when the war was nearing its end for Japan. For those who returned to the war after their brief rest, the physical toll of forced labor was irreversible. Many of the women were left permanently weakened, unable to fully recover from the long-term effects of exhaustion, malnutrition, and neglect. Yet this decision marked a subtle shift in how prisoner welfare was regarded by the Allies, even in the final years of the war. The prisoners, once regarded as little more than expendable labor, were now seen, if only for a moment, as human beings deserving of care. After the war, the survivors carried with them the emotional and physical scars of their experiences. For many, the end of the war did not bring immediate healing. The psychological trauma of captivity, combined with the stigma of being enemy nationals, left deep marks. Yet the brief moment of rest remained a defining memory for many. It was a rare glimpse of dignity, one that stood in stark contrast to the inhumanity they had endured. As the years passed, the stories of these women and their brief respite became part of the larger narrative of World War II. While their voices remained mostly silent during the war, the aftermath allowed them to share their stories, revealing the harsh realities of life in the Japanese internment and prisoner of war camps. It was not a chapter defined by victory or loss, but by survival, resilience, and the moments of humanity that pierced through the dark fog of war, the brief moment of rest for the Japanese women prisoners during World War II offers a poignant glimpse into the complexities of humanity amidst the brutalities of war. In a conflict that consumed millions and left countless individuals dehumanized, the decision to allow these women a moment to recover represents more than just a shift in policy. It is a reminder that even in the darkest times, the capacity for mercy and compassion can surface, though fleetingly. For the women, that short period of reprieve was a small, fragile acknowledgement of their humanity. It was a reminder that despite being caught in the relentless machinery of war, they were still individuals worthy of care. Yet the cost of war on them, physically, emotionally, and psychologically, was profound and irreversible. Their stories, though often overlooked in the broader narrative of wartime history, reflect the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable suffering. As we look back on this chapter of history, we are reminded not only of the horrors of war, but of the small, defining moments where humanity broke through. In the end, it was not the scale of battles or the decisions of generals that defined the lives of these women, but rather their ability to endure, to survive, and to hold on to their dignity in the face of overwhelming adversity. Their story is a reminder that even in the darkest corners of conflict, there are moments of light, however brief, that can change the course of a life.